which is called the age of the patriarchs. All right? So I'm going to turn to the next screen here. And as these pop up, again, they're already on your packet here, but we're going to talk through each of them. And the things that are in blue are the books that contain the story. So I'm not expecting you to memorize the books, just so that you know kind of as we go through the Old Testament, they do tell the story. So the first period of salvation history is what we call the Patriarch Period. Okay? You remember that from last year?
No.
So you know the patriarchs were the kind of like founding fathers of the Jewish people. Okay? And of course the original patriarch was Abraham. All right? Originally known as Abram. All right? So does anybody remember how the story began with Abraham? This is where you can really impress me with your knowledge from which you learned last year. How does the story begin with Abram? See, Tommy?
So I might have a few things wrong, but I'm pretty sure that he was like a regular old dude.
He was a regular old dude.
And
Yep.
God called on him
Uh-huh.
and he said, take with you all of your money and
Yep.
your family.
Take whatever you have.
Go to this certain place.
Uh-huh.
And he went there and then
Okay.
God,
That's great. So the story begins with God calling upon Abram and telling him, get up and go to a place that I've picked out for you. All right? That's exactly right. And Abram was supposed to have lived somewhere over in Mesopotamia. Okay? And he was just told, just go where I tell you to go. He didn't even know where it was. He didn't have a good map to look at. He was just, go somewhere, and this place I've picked out for you and your family. And he did. All right? Abram picked up, and he went, and he traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles. And when he got to the place that God had picked for him, God had said, okay, here you go. And then God began to make some promises to Abram. Okay? And if you remember, he had said, I will be your God, and you and your descendants will be my people. I will give this land to you and to all of your ancestors. And you will have as many children and descendants as there are. Remember this part? Cal? Yeah, stars in the sky. Look up in the sky and count them. That's how many descendants you're going to have. Now, it's ironic that at the time that promise was made, Abram had exactly 0 children. He didn't have any children at all. So you remember part of the promise was, and he was old, and so was his wife Sarah. And it was like, well, this is never going to happen. There's no way we're going to ever have any children. How can I have descendants as many as the stars? I don't have any. All right, well, God said, don't worry. It's going to happen. Okay? So God made all these promises, and Abram obeyed and did exactly what God told him. So that he traveled all the way to what was known as the land of Canaan, and God said, this is going to be your land. Okay? Your land, you're my people, I'm your God, I will take care of you. So that really is the beginning of this covenant promise that God makes. Okay, now we're not going to get into all the Abram stories. Again, we're just kind of trying to hit the main points. Probably the most famous story about Abram, who later was named Abraham after he accepted God's covenant promise, was a story that involved his son. His name was Isaac. So anyone tell us about that? Is it Cal?
So they had a son, and then God said to take him and his son up to a mountain to make, I think it was like a chapel or something, like a little altar.
Yeah, an altar, yeah.
Altar.
Uh-huh.
And then he said to him, sacrifice your son.
Uh-huh.
So he was about to do it, but then an angel flew in and told him, don't sacrifice.
That's exactly right.
And
Yeah.
then they sacrificed the lamb instead of the
You got the story exactly right. So this was the great test of faith. After God made all these promises, he had said, oh, by the way, I want you to sacrifice your son after he had been born. And of course, Abram, he didn't say, what are you talking about? I'm not going to do that. He said, okay, Lord. All right, and he was going to do it, as Cal said. But of course, then the angel said, whoa, no, don't. You don't have to. You proved your faith. So Abraham was a man of faith. He agreed to the original promise of God, and he was rewarded, as we know, with many descendants. Okay? So Abraham is the original patriarch. Isaac, his son, after being spared the knife, was able to become the next patriarch. Now, if you remember, Isaac married a woman named Rebekah, and they had 2 sons. Remember who their 2 sons were? This is continuing the story. See, Abby? Jacob and Esau. All Okay, Jacob and Esau. You remember that part? Did you learn that last year? So if you remember, they were twins. Okay, Esau was the older of the two by like a few seconds. Okay, you know, if you're a twin, you know, one of you has to be born first. All right, you don't come out at the same time. So, you know, Esau was the older of the two. And according to the customs of the time, whoever the firstborn was became the next patriarch. Okay? Now, the thing was, in the story, the Bible makes it very clear that Jacob was a pretty smart guy. Esau, not so smart. Okay? But he was the older of the two. So, according to the custom, he was supposed to become the next patriarch. But if you remember, it was Rebekah, actually, that was like, no, you know, Jacob needs to become the patriarch. You know, I love my son Esau, but he doesn't have what it takes. So if you remember, they concocted a little plan to try to make sure that Isaac would give his blessing or the birth promise to Jacob. You want to add to that?
Wasn't that the story with the soup?
Yeah. Fetch me some soup.
Like, I'll give you soup if you give me
Your birthright, yeah. And of course, stupid Esau made the trade. Now, the thing was that little trade really didn't mean anything because only the father could make that decision. So if you remember, Isaac couldn't see very well. Like, you know, Jerome, okay? Which son is that? I can't tell. And Jacob went in there and he pretended to be Esau, and Isaac gave his blessing to him. And of course, once the blessing was given, it can be taken away. And if you remember, Esau, when he found out, was really upset. In fact, he wanted to kill Jacob. I mean, he didn't, and they made up later. But Jacob becomes the new patriarch. That was like part of God's plan. Okay? Now, let's go on and talk about Jacob. So, Abraham had one son, okay, Isaac. Isaac had two sons. Jacob then now is the third patriarch. Now, he doesn't just have one or two sons. He has 12.
Wow.
What? He has 12. Now, why is that significant? Well, every one of those sons of his, in turn, became their own patriarch. So what we have here is the family of Abraham is now growing exponentially, okay? 2 sons, and it gets bigger and bigger, and there were 12 sons of Jacob. Now, the thing I want to see if you remember is Jacob had 12 sons. He did something that parents should not do, and that is he played favorites. He had a favorite son of his 12. So do you remember who the favorite son was? Jacob had 12 sons. Which one? Emily, do you remember?
Joseph?
Yeah, it was Joseph. Okay, in fact, Joseph also was very young. He was one of the last sons that he had. So you probably know this part of the story. Joseph was his favorite son. He even gave him this great colored coat, okay, that was to say, hey, this is my favorite son, okay? All the others, hey, they're okay, but Joseph's the best. And if you remember in the story, the other brothers hate Joseph. Okay, they're jealous of him. And if you remember, basically, there's a story where Joseph was supposed to go out and fetch his brothers. And you remember what his brothers decided to do? See, Sydney?
Didn't they sell him to?
Yeah, they decided to sell him. Now, if you remember, originally they were just going to kill him. They were going to flat out throw him into a well and drown him. But then one of his brothers was like, that's a bit rough. I mean, yeah, he is a pain, but we don't want to kill him. Hey, how about if we sell him? That way, we can get money for him, and we get rid of him at the same time. That's called win-win, okay? So that's exactly what they do. So if you remember, Joseph is then sold to a caravan of traders, and they are traveling to, and this is the important part of the story, they're going to Egypt. So Joseph ends up being taken to Egypt, and then, of course, his brothers tell Jacob, we're sorry, but, he's dead, okay? He was killed by wild animals. And, of course, Jacob is heartbroken, but he believes him, okay? So the Patriarch period, notice how we go from they're living in the land of Canaan, the promised land, but then Joseph ends up being sold to Egypt. Now, if you know the other part of the story, there's a famine that hits the land of Canaan. Remember, they didn't have food? So Jacob tells his other brothers, go to Egypt because there's lots of food there, okay? Plenty of food in Egypt. Now, when Joseph went to Egypt, you remember what happened to him? He was sold there a slave, but then stuff started happening. See, Graham?
So he was sold there as a slave, and then stuff happened, and he became king.
If you remember, he had a wonderful skill
Yeah,
that
don't
changed
we
his
do
life.
that?
Remember what he was able to do? Graham, since you brought that up.
He was able to like interpret dreams.
He was able to interpret dreams. That's right. And remember, Pharaoh had a dream, and Joseph was able to tell him about it. He's like, "Oh, hey, you're pretty cool. Okay, you're a slave. Tell you what, I got a job for you." Okay, so Joseph ends up getting his freedom, and he is given a promotion. He's not made Pharaoh, but he's made like the chief minister of Egypt. So he's like the number 2 guy in the deck of cards. Okay, so things have turned around for him quite a bit. Now, meanwhile, back in Canaan, there's food shortages, there's fear and loathing, and of course Jacob's like, we got to get food. So he sends his brothers on a mission to Egypt to get food. And of course, here's the greatest part of the story. They end up coming to Egypt, and of course, who do they have to see to try to get food?
Joseph.
They have to see the minister of the kingdom. Okay, only they don't know that it's their brother, but he knows it's them. Okay, and of course, there's this wonderful moment when he's able to. He kind of plays with them. You remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's like, I think you guys are trying, you guys are spies. You know what happens to spies? Oh, I know we're not spies. We just need food. Okay? And then, of course, eventually Joseph's like, okay, I can't play the game anymore. It's me. It's your brother. And, of course, they're like, oh, my gosh, they can't believe it. But he forgives them, and they have a nice little family reunion. And then Joseph says, I'll tell you what, not only am I going to get food for you guys, but you know what? You need to stay here because the famine is not going to end anytime soon. There's food here. I will put you up, and you'll have a great place to live and everything. So Jacob and all of the family moved to Egypt. Okay, and that's the key point here is at the end of the Patriarch period, they decide to move to Egypt because there's food there. Okay? And everything is great until it's not great. Okay? And that takes us to period number 2. Okay? All right, now, this is what we call the second period in our timeline is called the Exodus period. And again, I think you guys know this well as well. So, someone tell me, things were great until they weren't great. What happened? Like for a long time, like for hundreds of years, they were living in Egypt and everything was great. But then something happened. You remember what happened? This takes us into the Book of Exodus. I'm sorry, the Book of Exodus. See, Cal?
Didn't they kill every child of?
Okay, well, you're talking about the Egyptians, right?
Oh,
Yeah, Pharaoh. Okay, you're right. They did end up doing that. The reason why is because it said that there was a new king, and the new king did not like the Hebrews. Okay, he had forgotten. He didn't even know who Joseph was, and they were growing in size. So this little band of Hebrews now were becoming larger and larger, and the Bible says that the Egyptians didn't like that, so they began to oppress them. Okay, and enslave them. So they went from being happy in Egypt to now they didn't want to be there. Okay. All right, and then of course this brings a new hero onto the stage. And they shall call him, see Gabby?
Moses?
Yeah, Moses. So of course you guys know the story about Moses. Little baby boy, he's a Hebrew, okay? As Cal said, the king ordered all the Hebrew baby children killed, all the boys, okay? So his mother, of course, didn't want that to happen, so she puts him in a little basket, floats him down the river, try to hide him. He ends up being discovered by one of the daughters of Pharaoh. The daughter's like, oh, hey, look, I've always wanted a little baby, and here's a baby. All right, I'll take it, okay? And, of course, Moses ends up being raised in the house of the royal family. All right, so he's raised as an Egyptian. He doesn't even know for a long time that, he's even a Jewish Hebrew, okay? And, of course, eventually, though, something happens that gets him in trouble. You remember what Moses ends up doing, which makes things tough for him? See, Graham?
Isn't he kill someone that's
Yeah. Beating on a Hebrew.
slave owner?
Yeah, like a slave or, an official, and he kills him. And then, of course, he's wanted for murder. So he ends up having to run away. He ends up running out in the desert, and he ends up tending sheep for a few years, okay? Until one day, he sees a burning bush. And remember the voice in the bush says, Moses, who are you? Remember, I am. Okay, go back and tell the Pharaoh to let my people go. And of course, that is exactly what he does. So he ends up going back to Egypt. He appears before the Pharaoh. Remember, he tells Pharaoh that, God, I am tells you to let his people go. And of course, Pharaoh says, Nope, not interested. Okay? He's like, hey, I tell you what, you better listen. This God is real. Okay? If you don't, bad things are going to happen. And the Pharaoh's like, all right, make them happen. All right? Make it rain, so to speak. And of course, Moses does, or God does. All right? Because we know there are 10 plagues that strike the land of Egypt. And it takes all 10 of them to get the Pharaoh to change his mind. So he changes his mind. He lets the Israelites go. And then he decides that he didn't want to. And he sends his army after them. And they get to the sea. And they're trapped. But the sea parts. The Israelites are able to get away. The army follows and, of course, are drowned in the sea. So that is literally, that's the Exodus. Them getting their freedom to get out of Egypt so they can go back to their homeland. Because remember, that's what the original promise was. Okay? All right, now, if you remember, they were going to leave Egypt, and it should have taken a few months at the most for them to get to Canaan, but it takes a lot longer than that. You remember how long it takes for them before they get back to the land of Canaan? See, Andrew?
Wasn't it like around 50 years?
Well, you're a little bit lower. You're close. It's one of those biblical numbers. It didn't take them 50 years, but it took them 40 years. Okay, and they were out in the desert wandering around. That actually is when Moses was given the commandments to give to the people. Okay, you remember the story of the golden calf? People started worshiping other gods, and of course God was not happy. So yeah, all that happened in that 40-year period. And the Bible says by the time that they got near Canaan, every one of these remnants of the Hebrews had died, except for 2 of them. You know, even Moses died before they actually got back to the homeland. Okay, but they did get back. All right, so that is how the Exodus period ends. Okay, the third period is the Joshua/Judges period. Okay, so again, follow the story here. So we know Moses dies, and the Israelites were right there at the edge of Canaan. Now the problem for them is that when they got to Canaan, and this is kind of common sense, when they got to Canaan, there were already people living there called Canaanites. Okay? Are they just going to go, oh, hey, yeah, come and just take over our land? No, the people there didn't want them. So they're going to have to fight their way into Canaan. Now, since Moses is dead, the new leader is Joshua. Okay? Yes, Jordan, you want to add?
Didn't they walk around the walls?
Okay, well, the most famous story about Joshua, okay, is the Battle of Jericho. So, yeah, you're right. They had to march around the walls, and they blew the horns, and the walls came down, and they took the town. Well, in the book of Joshua, there's a whole bunch of battles that they fight. Okay, the Jericho is the most famous one, but they had to conquer literally town by town, and Joshua was the guy that did that. Okay, so now they're getting their homeland back. Now, Joshua is going to die after a long time, and there's no one really to take over for him. Okay, so this takes us into the next book, which is called the Book of Judges. Now, did you learn about the Judges last year?
Yeah.
Okay, now this is the part of the Bible that people, they start to get real real foggy about, okay? Because a lot of the judges are not very famous. But basically what had happened was after Joshua died, it's like, we need a leader. And they didn't have one particular great leader. So they ended up basically calling upon a whole string of people, okay, to kind of become their leader, all right? And there were 12 of these judges. 6 of them are pretty famous. 6 of them are not. One of them was even a woman, okay? But you remember anything about the judges from last year? This whole time? It was not a good time for the Israelites. See, Riley, do you remember?
I think the girl was Ruth.
Well, you're in the right time period. Ruth came a little bit later, but you're in the right time period. Actually, her name was Deborah. Her name was Deborah, okay? The most famous judge, though, was the guy named Samson. He had long hair, really strong. You studied him, you know his story. Okay, he ends up getting his hair cut, and he drinks alcohol, which he's not supposed to do, and then, of course, he loses all his strength, and then he ends up being captured. Well, he was a judge. He was a judge, okay? But the whole thing about the book of Judges is there was nobody else to be their leader, so they had to call upon these people who were less than perfect, okay? The judges were very rough people. For example, one of them told God that if he would help him win a battle, he would sacrifice the first person that came out of his house. And it turned out the first person to come out of his house was his daughter. All right? Like, well, of course, he didn't kill his daughter. Oh, yeah, he did. Okay? He had to sacrifice her just to win a battle. Okay? And there was another judge that conspired to have a person assassinated. They fell asleep and they took a tent peg and they drove it through their head. Okay? And of course, you know, Samson was a pretty rough guy also. So what I'm sharing those stories with you to let you know the judges were not the greatest of people, but they were the only leaders that the Israelites had. Okay? Yes, Cap?
Didn't they call upon, like, Gideon, that was his name?
Gideon was another judge. That's right. Yeah, there's stories about him as well. Okay? So yeah. The very last verse of Judges kind of sums it all up. It said, in those days, the people did not have a king. They simply did what they thought was best, which is kind of a way of saying it's too bad they didn't have a king. But during that time, the judges were the best people that they had. Okay, now section 4, or period 4, is called the rise of the monarchy. Okay, and this is easy to remember. They didn't like the judges. They wanted something better. What's better than having a judge? Is to have a king. Okay, so period 4 is called the rise of the monarchy. And we're going to talk about when Israel started to have kings. Okay? Now, in the Bible, they had a whole bunch of kings. We're not going to worry about most of them. The ones that I want you to worry about are the first 3. Saul, David, and Solomon. Okay? And you can find their stories in the 1st and 2nd book of Samuel and in the 1st and 2nd book of Kings. Okay? Which, of course, is about the kings. Now, did you learn about Saul last year?
So, yeah, we did.
So you remember the people were like, we want a king, like everybody else.
No, we didn't learn that, but I know the story.
Okay, well, there was a guy named Samuel who was kind of like a priest and prophet, and God told him, hey, go and find them a king. They want a king. I want them to have a king. So Samuel went out, and his job was to go out and find that guy, okay? And it turned out that it was Saul, who was just a teenage boy. Might have had pimples on his face, who knows, okay? He wasn't very old at all. And when Samuel said, guess what? You've been chosen to become the first king of Israel. He's like, well, I don't want to be king. Well, I'm not interested in that, okay? Sounds like a tough job. He's like, well, God picked you, all right? He's made his promise to the people, and you're that guy. So Saul originally didn't even want to be king. But then once Samuel blessed him, he was like, okay, I'll be king. And he was pretty good for a while. Like, he was really popular. He won battles, and the people were really happy with their king. But after a while, the Bible says, you remember what started to happen to Saul? Maybe?
Like, he started to disrespect God?
Well, he did. Yeah, he started to make bad decisions. The Bible implies that he started to go insane, which is not a good thing when someone loses their mind. And he started doing really crazy stuff, okay? And in fact, eventually God said, I know I said that Saul was the right guy, but you know what? He's not the right guy. All right, somebody else is. So Saul became very unpopular, and sadly, he ends up committing suicide on a battlefield. He loses the battle, and rather than be captured, he kills himself, which in the Bible, that's about the worst thing you could have to happen. Okay, so who ends up becoming the next king?
Is it David?
It is David. Okay, it is David. And of course, you probably know the most famous David story was when he defeated Goliath. And in fact, when he did that, he was just a shepherd boy, and he became a hero. And suddenly people were like, hey, he would be a good king. Forget Saul. Let's make David king, all right? And that did end up happening. After Saul died, David is made the new king. And the Bible praises David. I mean, he's very popular. There's lots of stories about him doing great things. One of the things that David wanted to do is he wanted to build a temple to the Lord, okay, in the city of Jerusalem, which he had made the new capital. But the Bible says that God told him in a dream, he said, you're not going to do that, okay? Your son will do that, okay? So David had to pretty much live his whole life as king, knowing that he was never going to have that temple built. You might also know that there's some stories where David also made some bad choices. Do you remember the story of David and Bathsheba, where he stole a man's wife and then had the guy killed? Did you learn that? Okay, that wasn't one of his better days, okay? But he still was a very popular king, and God forgave him for what he did, all right? But then when he died, his son Solomon became king. And the Bible says that Solomon took what David started and made it even better. In fact, Solomon is considered to be a golden age for the Jewish people. And he was able to do the thing that his father wanted to but couldn't. he was able to actually have built the temple, not just a temple, but I mean the temple in Jerusalem for the Jewish people. And that's why the first temple is called Solomon's Temple. So Solomon was a really good king. He wasn't perfect, just like David wasn't, but he was kind of considered a golden age. So this rise of the monarchy is kind of the golden age of ancient Israel. Now, let's go to the fifth time period. What's going to happen is that Solomon has a son who's going to take over for him. And unfortunately, his son, whose name was Rehoboam, the guy was a complete jerk. Okay? He was a complete jerk. And when he became king, he went before a big crowd of people and said, I'm the new king. I'm in charge now. I'm going to raise your taxes and I'm going to enslave all of you. You're going to build whatever I tell you to build. Now, if you're a king or a president or a mayor or whatever you are, you don't get up in front of a bunch of people and say, I'm going to raise your taxes and I'm going to enslave you. And if you don't like it, tough, because I'm in charge. All right? Nobody in their right mind would say that. But Rehoboam said it, okay? And the crowd of people, when they heard that, you know what they said? They said, forget you, okay? We're not going to sign up for that, okay? We are not going to accept you as a king if you're going to act that way. So what ended up happening is when Rehoboam did that, the kingdom is going to split, okay? It's going to become divided. This is called the division of the kingdom. And the people that did not want Rehoboam to be their leader are going to simply break away. It's kind of like a civil war, okay? And they're going to appoint their own king, and they're going to become their own kingdom. Now, did you learn this last year?
Yes.
Did you talk about the division of the kingdom?
Yeah.
This map I have up here is really important. So the southern kingdom, this was the original kingdom. Jerusalem is here. They took the name Judah, and of course they still had their king Rehoboam. But then all the people up here created their own kingdom, and they came to be known as Israel. So there's the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. So you did learn that last year?
Yeah.
Okay, that's really important to understand because for the next several hundred years, that's the way things are. Okay, the kingdom being divided. Now, what happens when a country or a kingdom becomes divided? Because now they had two kings, two capitals, two kingdoms, two armies, two of everything. What happened because of that? And again, we're following the story. Everything leads to something else. See, Andrew, what happened?
Usually, are dropping down and
Uh-huh.
falling in.
Yeah, they decline. They become less powerful. They start having problems, okay? And that's exactly what happened. The kingdom that was unified and strong now is divided and weakened. Now, it just so happened that right at the same time when the kingdoms became divided, there was a new threat on the horizon, and it was the empire of Assyria. Okay, did you learn about the Assyrians last year?
Yes.
Okay, well really all you need to know is that they were one of those Mesopotamian empires. They were very warlike. They were known for being invincible on the battlefield, and they were vicious. I mean, they would conquer towns, and they would just slaughter all the people and just terrorize people. And that's how they would conquer people, was really by intimidation. So the Assyrians are going to defeat the northern kingdom. Okay, in 722, which is a red letter date in history, the northern kingdom got completely obliterated by the Assyrians. Forever. Okay, there was never a northern kingdom again. So you can just put a big cross over them. The only thing left is the southern kingdom. All right, so that takes us into the sixth period. Because the southern kingdom, you think they're going to get off the hook? Well, they're not going to be conquered by the Assyrians. They're going to be able to hold out for a while. But eventually, they are going to fall to the Babylonians. And of course, the Babylonians were just another one of those Mesopotamian empires who took over after the Assyrians did. And they are going to conquer the southern kingdom of Judah. And that's going to happen in the year 586. Now, when they do this, they're going to do several things. They're going to burn the city of Jerusalem. They're going to destroy the temple. Supposedly, they also destroyed the ark that they kept the commandments in. So, despite what Indiana Jones is supposed to have found, the ark was destroyed forever. Okay? And they took the king of the southern kingdom, poked his eyes out,
Oh.
and dragged him back to Babylon along with thousands and thousands of Jewish people. So a complete beatdown by the Babylonians. Now, this sixth period here is called the captivity period. Why is it called that? Well, all of the Jewish people were captured and they were made to go live in Babylon. So they were dragged away from their homeland to go and live somewhere else. So they call it the captivity period. They also call it the exile. And this was a very dark time for the Jewish people. In fact, the people at that time probably thought, God has just completely forgot us. All the promises that this was going to be our land, our home, and he was going to be our God. Where is he? We just got defeated by, the nastiest enemy, in the land. God must have forgotten us. Okay? So that's why it's such a sad time for them. It's time.
Wasn't there like the 12 tribes of Israel?
Okay, well, when the northern kingdom got conquered, 10 of the 12 tribes were conquered with them.
Ooh. Oh.
Okay? In fact, they're called the 10 lost tribes of Israel because they were defeated, dragged away by the Assyrians, and they never showed up again. So there were only 2 tribes left in Judah, and they got conquered. Okay? Now, at this time, this is kind of when the prophets started appearing, like Elijah and Elisha and Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah, all these prophets you hear about so much. And of course, they were telling the people, hey, if you don't want these bad things to keep happening, turn back to God, okay? Because he will save you, all right? So that was kind of their message. Now, of course, they usually were not listened to, and that's kind of why all these bad things happen. Okay, let's go to the 7th time period. After about 50 years, Babylon is going to get conquered. Which, if you're a Jewish person, you're like, yay, good, because they conquered us and now they're conquered. And there is a king named Cyrus the Great who conquered the Babylonians. And he told all the Jewish people in Babylon, hey, if you guys want to go back home, you can do it. I'll let you go. You can go back to your homeland. In fact, not only will I let you go back to your homeland, I'll help you rebuild your city of Jerusalem. Because I know the Babylonians, damaged it badly. And I'll tell you what, if you want to rebuild your
Temple.
not the ark, temple, I'll help you do that as well. Okay? And they were like, yeah, sure. So the 7th period is called the restoration period. Now, what does that mean, restoration? See, Morgan? Yeah, it's like repairing. Now, hopefully none of you have ever had like flooding in your basement or anything, but if you have, you've had to have restoration work done. Try to fix it, repair it, make it good again. So this is called the restoration period because the Jewish people were allowed to go back home and get their cities rebuilt and get their temple rebuilt. And basically, a temple 2.0, okay? And they did do that, all right? The second temple was rebuilt. Now, someone pointed out last period, they said, well, that's like 50, 60 years later. I mean, a lot of those people that had been captured, they probably had died. And it's like, yeah, they had, okay? A lot of the people who were made to go live in Babylon, they never did come back home. And some of the people that lived at this time had never lived in Judah, okay? So to say they were going back home, some of them had never been there. But they were told, hey, that's our homeland. And if they're going to let us go back, let's go back. So that's exactly what they did. One of the most important people during the restoration period was a guy named Ezra. Ezra was a prophet, and he was the guy that said, okay, we're going to rebuild it. It's going to be bigger and better than it ever was before. But we need to put our faith in God. Okay? And that's why they did that. Okay, the 8th and final period is called the Post-Exile Period. Why is it called that? Well, the word post means after, and exile means to be made to go somewhere. So this is the time after the exile period. Now, this was kind of a good and bad time combined because they were allowed to come back to their homeland, but they still were not ruling themselves. Okay? So the post-exile period is a time when the Jewish people had come back to Judah, the promised land, but they were being ruled by a bunch of foreign rulers. Now, I don't expect you to necessarily memorize all of these in succession, but they were ruled by these kingdoms, starting with the Persians. So they were ruled by the Persians for a while. Then there were some Greek kings who came to power, and they were ruled by the Greek kings. And then at some point they were allowed to start having their own kings again, but the kings were not very popular. And the reason why they weren't is because they were puppet kings. Do you know what a puppet king is? See, Tommy?
It basically means like the people like who are stronger than them
Uh-huh.
set up their own government.
Yep.
So that looks like they're
Yeah, so they're king, but someone's telling them what to do, right? And this is what was happening at this time. The Jewish people did have their own kings, which, by the way, most of them were named Herod. You've read in the Bible about King Herod? There actually were a whole bunch of kings who took the name Herod. And as you know in the Bible, they're not very popular. And it was because people kind of knew, oh, they're not really in charge. They're just doing whatever they have to keep their power, okay? So they were not popular at all. And then eventually, the Romans took over. And of course, when you get to the New Testament and Jesus' time, the Romans were ruling the Jewish people. Now, there's one story I want to share with you that comes from the Post-Exile Period, and it actually comes from the Book of Maccabees. You remember the Book of Maccabees? I only ask because it's one of those 7 deuterocanonical books. Now, I'm not going to... The book is just filled with different stories, but the Maccabee family was a Jewish family who had decided they were tired of their people being ruled by foreign rulers. And they wanted to get all their freedom. And there was a guy named Judas Maccabeus. Okay, he was like the main guy. And there was a story that about the Greek king who was ruling Jerusalem at the time. And he had no respect for God whatsoever. Okay, he was a pagan, basically. And he had told the Jewish people, I am going to erect a statue of the God that I believe in. And I'm going to have it put up in the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. Well, Judas Maccabeus said, no. There will be no statue of any other god put up in the temple of our God. I will not permit it. If I have to kill somebody, I will do it. Well, the king was like, oh, you know what? I want this statue put up there. So what ended up happening is Judas Maccabeus was standing at the entrance of the temple and said, not in our house, not in our temple, not going to happen. Well, there was someone who was going to try to do it, okay, was going to go and try to offer up a sacrifice to a foreign god. And you know what Judas Maccabeus did? Drew out his sword and killed the god. Now you might say, gosh, that's awful. Well, he told them, not in our house. All right, no pagan gods in this temple. All right, we will destroy anybody who tries to do that. So the Maccabees were rebels who were basically saying, we're going to drive out pagans and we're going to get our city back. Okay, so that's what the Book of Maccabees basically is about. All right, so at the end of all of this, we have Jesus being born around the year 4 BC and ushering in the next part of salvation history. But in the 8 periods that we just talked through, we had God selecting his people, making a promise to them struggling throughout all these centuries, sometimes losing their land, then getting it back, being told to turn back and be faithful to him, being ruled by other people at times. But when you get to it, when Jesus came into the world, it was God's promise is being fulfilled. And that's why Jesus was able to say, I've come to fulfill all of this, not get rid of it. Okay? But that is the story of salvation history. Okay? That is the story. All right? I didn't do it in 5 minutes, but I wanted you to kind of see how the story does connect. I mean, it does connect from the very beginning all the way to the very last one. Okay? Can you guys tell the story of salvation history now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Good. All right.